Welcome, and thank you for joining the second day of the Sierra Club's three-part webinar series on nature-based adaptation to sea level rise. My name is Virginia Reinhardt, and I am the director of the Sierra Club's San Francisco Bay chapter, covering Contra Costa, Alameda, Marin, and San Francisco counties. We are co-presenting this series in partnership with the Sierra Club's Loma Prieta chapter, which covers San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Benito counties, and the Redwood chapter, which covers the Bay-adjacent Napa and Sonoma counties. The primary goal of this program is to connect decision makers with the information and resources that they need to restore living shorelines all around our bay. Last week, our expert panelists told us how nature-based adaptation can make our communities more resilient to the effects of climate change. John Bourgeois of Valley Water described how wetlands can actually keep pace with sea level rise. And Dr. Patty Oikawa described how even as they help keep us safe from climate impacts, wetlands are a key tool for fighting climate change through processes like carbon sequestration and carbon cycling. We learned about the value of living shorelines to wildlife that has been decimated over a century in which 80% of our tidal wetlands have been destroyed. Valerie Bloom of the US Fish and Wildlife Service described how the presence of key species on the landscape is an indicator that the natural systems are healthy and working, and providing the other benefits that are so important to humans. Three takeaways have stayed with me from last week's panel. First, we have to act now, so that when sea level rise accelerates at mid-century, we have established living shorelines already in place. Many areas around the bay are already vulnerable to flooding, with impacts disproportionately impacting communities of color. Second, we have to act together. Water knows no bounds. We can't work alone in our little corners of the bay. We have to work within the larger systems at play. And while this does sound daunting, there is plenty of reason for hope. As we will learn in greater detail from our panelists today and next week, restoration really works. And not only that, but there is money and brain power available to help make it happen. In just a moment, I will turn this over to the experts to tell you more, but first, a couple of housekeeping notes. You should see a Q&A box on your screen where you can type in questions for our panelists at any time. There will be a Q&A after our first three speakers' presentations and a second Q&A following our next three speakers. All three programs will soon be available on the chapter's YouTube pages as an ongoing resource. Finally, I want to convey our enormous gratitude to the incredible panelists for being here to share their work with us. I now have the honor to introduce you to the first of our speakers. Dave Pine is San Mateo County Supervisor and Chair of the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority.
Thank you, Virginia. It's a pleasure to join everyone this morning. First, let me start by thanking the Sierra Club for putting together such a terrific webinar series. This is really a fantastic group of speakers that are coming together over 3 different days. And it's terrific to see so many people participating by Zoom. This morning, I'm going to talk about the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. I'll talk about the origins of the authority, how it's working today. I'll talk about a new regulatory process that's been put in place to expedite permitting, and close with a few remarks about the Restoration Authority's focus on social justice and equity. So let me just jump right into it. So we've heard a lot during the presentations to date, and we'll hear a lot more as we proceed about the remarkable benefits of tidal wetlands. They really are just a tremendous, provide tremendous ecosystem services. They provide habitat for fish and wildlife. They can actually filter and remove pollution. They do a remarkable job sequestering carbon. We all enjoy the open space and recreation opportunities they afford us. Here in the Bay Area, of course, our bay is, defines our community, and it's fundamental to our quality of life and economy. And then fortunately, they also provide flood prevention and sea level rise mitigation. But we've lost an awful lot of our tidal wetlands, as has been mentioned and will be discussed later today. We've lost approximately 80% from when Europeans first arrived. There were about 200,000 acres, and that dropped down to about 40,000 in 1998. We'll hear more later in the day about our efforts to restore some of those wetlands. But the chart on the right shows that There are about 38,000 acres that are in position to be restored, about 13,000 of which have been restored. So we're making progress towards a goal of having 100,000 acres of healthy tidal wetlands in the Bay Area. So the Bay Restoration Authority was established by the legislature in 2008 to put in place a mechanism for raising funds on a local level to address tidal wetland restoration. It has a governing board made up of 7 local elected officials. Those are appointed by the ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments. It also has a community advisory committee and an oversight committee. So that was that's the basic structure of the Restoration Authority. And during its first 8 years, it spent a lot of time looking at different mechanisms for raising monies locally to do bay restoration. And then in 2016, it developed Measure AA. So Measure AA is a parcel tax. It's $12 per parcel, and it applies to every parcel in all 9 counties of the Bay Area. So it's really quite a historic measure in that it does apply in the entire 9-county area. The tax raises about $25 million a year. So over its 20-year lifespan will raise about $500 million. We were very pleased to see this measure pass with over 70% of the vote in the 9 counties. Now, one thing we learned in the campaign is just how much the Bay Area people want to see the Bay improved and see it left to the next generation in a better condition than it is now. But Measure AA won't fund everything. It's always been envisioned as a mechanism for seeking out and matching funds from state and federal authorities. So what does the Restoration Authority do? It provides funds for habitat projects that will restore or protect tidal wetlands, managed ponds, or other natural habitats along the shoreline. It does allow expenditures on flood management, such as levees, but those levees have to be required as part of the restoration project. Similarly, Measure AA funds can be used for recreational amenities such as trails, but again, in connection with a restoration project. More specifically, Measure AA has 4 program categories that are listed here. Expenditures need to fit into one of these 4 categories: safe, clean water and pollution prevention, fish, bird, and wildlife habitat protection, integrated flood protection, or shoreline public access. So one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about Measure AA is what is the shoreline? Where can Measure A funds be expended? And it's more than just the baylands. I mean, baylands are defined as the area that lie between the maximum and minimum high tides. But Measure AA can also be used for subtidal habitats. So those are areas lying below mean low tide. And they can also be used in creeks and rivers up to the head of tide. And finally, the funds can be used for transition zones, which are uplands adjacent to wetlands, to give wetlands room to migrate in the future. Measure AA also has a formula providing, allocating the funds on a geographic basis. 50% of the Measure AA money can be spent anywhere in the Bay, but the other 50% is allocated as shown here across 4 regions in the Bay based on population. So for example, in the South Bay, 12% of the total funding is dedicated to Santa Clara County, but Santa Clara can also access the other 50% that is available Bay Area wide. When we set out with Measure A, we established a number of goals which are listed here, and they're quite ambitious, but we're making good progress against them already. The top level goal is to use Measure AA funds to restore 15,000 acres of wetlands and tidal marsh. And so far we've funded projects that would achieve about 32% of that. Other goals are to maintain and enhance 1,500 acres of managed ponds, seasonal wetlands, and sandy beach habitat, restore eelgrass habitat and shellfish habitat, construct 20 miles of levees. Again, these levees would be built in connection with restoration projects, construct 25 miles of bay trail, and construct at least 15 trails and staging areas or public access facilities. And as you can see in the parentheses here, we're making progress against those goals. So far, the authority has expended or authorized $106 million across 23 projects. While this map is difficult to really look at carefully, you can see that the projects have been funded around the entire bay. Let me take a minute and just talk about a couple of the projects to give you a sense for how the Measure A funds are being expended. First, the South Bay Shoreline project. This is located in the Alviso area of San Jose. This project entails restoring 2,900 acres of former salt evaporation ponds. But before that can be done, a 4-mile levee needs to be constructed, which will include upland transition areas and an ecotone area. This will also include trails and viewing platforms. Now, this is a very, very expensive project and has many funders. The total price tag for this project is in excess of $180 million. The authority so far has committed about $60 million to this project, and other funders are the Army Corps of Engineers, Valley Water, and the Coastal Conservancy. Next is our project at 900 Innes in San Francisco. This is an extraordinarily exciting project because it is part of an initiative to create a waterfront park in the India Basin area of the Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. So this area was formerly heavily industrial. It was a shipbuilding area. So the shoreline has a lot of contaminants. Measure AA funds will be used to clean up this shoreline, including cleanup of some of the subtidal areas. The Encino Dunes Restoration Project is located in the city of Alameda. It entails the removal of ice plant and restoring dune habitats. This beach site is really well suited to support a number of endangered species, including the snowy plover. And it will also improve opportunities for non-motorized watercraft to be launched. A similar project is the Long Beach Restoration Project. Long Beach is a beach in an embankment in San Leandro that protects the San Leandro shoreline marshlands. And beach erosion and rising sea levels are threatening these marshlands. So the authority has granted funds to conduct environmental studies and to develop a conceptual design for the restoration of this area. This is actually an important point to keep in mind, is that Measure AA funds can be used for design, not only for construction. And then finally, the invasive Spartina removal project helps fund the eradication of invasive cordgrass throughout the Bay Area. Let me take a little tangent now and talk about another element of measure of the Restoration Authority, which I think people will find of interest, which is our efforts to expedite the permitting of projects in the Bay Area. You know, frequently permitting takes an extraordinary amount of time and a lot of money and is very complex. And it's, you know, when you have 6 or 7 different agencies looking at a project, oftentimes it's a real challenge for projects to make it through the review. And as we've heard, you know, we need to move quickly to establish these marshlands in light of sea level rise. So given this challenge, the Restoration Authority has helped create something called the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. That's quite a mouthful. We refer to it as the BRIT. And the BRIT has brought together the 7 agencies shown here on the slide to work together in a way to expedite permit grants. The BRIT is funded by these 5 agencies, including the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. The funding is $1.25 million a year over 5 years. And the Restoration Authority is providing about $600,000 of that amount. So what does the BRIT do? The BRIT brings together the resource agency staff and has them, you know, work as a team and function as a really one unit. They hold pre-application meetings with project sponsors. They coordinate questions and comments to facilitate communication with the applicants. COVID permitting, they visit sites as a team. And there's also performance measures for making sure their work proceeds in a timely way. So to qualify for review under the BRIT process, you don't necessarily have to be a project that the Restoration Authority has funded, but you do need to be a project that would qualify for Restoration Authority funds. So the BRIT is, again, beneficial to a larger group of projects beyond just the ones funded by the Restoration Authority. Another element of this regulatory process or reform is the creation of a policy management team. This consists of high-level officials at the agencies that you've seen listed earlier. And their job is to deal with issues that the permitting team is wrestling with and can't resolve. And also to look at kind of long-standing issues that cause permitting to sometimes get bogged down. Like, for example, type conversion. Type conversion refers to when a large-scale restoration project will convert one type of habitat into another. So if you convert a salt pond into a tidal marsh, the question becomes, well, what kind of mitigation, if any, is required? So the policy and management team is charged with wrestling with that kind of question. Similarly with public access, some agencies put a very high value on public access, while other agencies put a higher value on habitat protection. The policy management team is charged with trying to find the right balance there. So let me conclude with just a couple of remarks about the Restoration Authority's commitment to equity and environmental justice. The authority has always put a high priority on environmental justice and economically disadvantaged communities. In our ranking process, for example, a key factor in scoring applicants is whether the project benefits an economically disadvantaged community. In addition, we've been working to identify groups or gaps in Measure AA grant process relating to serving economically disadvantaged communities. And one such, one process we've come up with to improve equity in grant making is our new community grant program. The community grant program allows for small grants of up to $100,000, which are considered on a rolling basis. So these grants are designed for community-based organizations and are perfect for things such as small shoreline habitat projects, such as planting native plants. And we just recently awarded our first community grant, which went to the Marin City Urban Wetland Community Project. And they're using their grant funds to conduct a community visioning process to restore a degraded stormwater detention basin and restore that to wetlands and open habitat. So that concludes my brief summary of the Restoration Authority. It's been exciting to watch the authority evolve and blossom over the last number of years. It's really a remarkable tool we have here in the Bay Area to fund restoration. It's really a national, if not an international model for how communities can come together to address ecosystem health and addressing sea level rise. So I appreciate your attention this morning.
Thanks so much, Dave. That was incredible information. I want to remind everyone watching that if you are inspired to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature on the screen, and we will be able to take questions after our third and then after our sixth speakers. So I next have the honor to introduce Robin Grossinger of the San Francisco Estuary Institute.
Thanks, Virginia, and thanks to the organizers. I know it takes a lot of work to organize an event like this. Really appreciate that. I was asked to talk about sort of the big picture of the history and transformation of the Bay, looking through that into the future. So I'm going to look back beyond our familiar Bay to before that Bay was even here, looking back 10,000 years ago or so. using these neat visualizations by Tanya Atwater. This shows the bay, or the absence of the bay, not that long ago, 10,000 years, not that long in the geologic time frame. And those light green areas that sort of approximate the shape of the bay are actually valley lowlands, grasslands and oak savannas and riparian corridors along the creeks before the sea rised into what we now call the bay. So this is when the last ice age was ending and the glaciers were melting and sea level was rising quite rapidly. And so the bay filled over the past 10,000 years to different intermediate points with various shapes and sizes until in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, it started slowing, sea level rise started slowing down to the more, to us, normal rate of 1 millimeter or 2 a year. And it started to approximate the shape that we're familiar with. And the marshes started to build in more and more as sea level rise slowed, to the point where the bay reached what might be sort of a familiar shape, a couple of centuries ago. So we can see that the bay was sort of this shape-shifting, always expanding entity. And the thing is, and realize that the bay has always, at least this bay has always been rising, different rates, and always as the sea level rose consistently, different rates, but consistently over the past 10,000 years, as the sea rose, the bay expanded, its footprint reached out and took over more and more of the valley of the bay. So the next point that I observe, looking at the history of the bay, the long-term history of the bay, is that people lived alongside the bay all of that time. Indigenous peoples, the native tribes, arrived before the formation of the bay, and the bay has always been a source of incredible resources of transportation and navigation, way to get around the region. And so people always lived at the edge of the bay. We don't have maps of that because those areas were submerged, but they undoubtedly lived along the edge of the bay, as evidenced in this map of the distribution of shell mounds a century ago, largely around the edge of the bay. So this brings up a second point to me, which is that the people have always lived at the bay shore, and they had to move inland. Not every year, not every day, but gradually, perhaps episodically, at multiple generations or at the century scale. Inevitably, the bay was getting bigger, and people had to adapt to that. So then a really interesting and anomalous thing happened, which is that if the bay had reached roughly this shape 200, 150, 200 years ago, this would be like a high tide, the full spill, the full extent of the bay that it had reached, then we actually reduced the size of the bay dramatically. So very anomalous, given that the bay had been getting bigger steadily for 10,000 years. Then suddenly, in this brief blip of time, we reduced the size of the bay. So during the past 150 years, the size of the bay decreased by almost a third. Really a remarkable achievement, or anomalous period in time, arguably. And it, of course, narrowed, got smaller at the same time that sea level was still going up, right? But it just was confined into a narrower area. So it was just moving up, but it wasn't moving out. In fact, it was moving in. So we can see that we established that sort of shape of the bay quite a while ago, interestingly, culturally, kind of historically. So this is a photo from around 1940 of Mission Bay after it's already been filled in and highly developed. So this had, by 1940 or 39, whenever this photograph is, the Mission Bay had already been filled for many decades at that point. If we compare that view to a more contemporary view, we see the giant stadium, and we see new freeways, and we see kind of like variation in the wharf pattern, but the shoreline stays remarkably the same. And that's even though the land side changes really dramatically. Like, as I said, the railroads, the highways, many of the buildings, the land use, really dramatically different, but the shoreline, almost remarkably exactly the same. Sorry, that may get a little annoying. I never get tired of going back and forth there, but I'll stop now. So great variation on the land side, but this fixed point, this fixed line. Similarly, if we go over here to the other side of the bay in more of a salt pond area at Coyote Hills, you'll see tremendous transformation on the land side, but the line, shoreline, staying almost exactly the same. I'll just do it twice this time. So this construct, this physical and in a way mental construct of the shoreline has seemed remarkably stable, like a permanent feature. For over a century in most places, it seemed it's all we've known, those of us who are alive today and our predecessors in the region, it seemed like a fixed shoreline. So we gotten used to, these historic features and these sort of long-term features that persisted around the edge of the bay. Now, of course, that's why we're all here. We probably know that period of stability, of seeming permanence, is somewhat coming to an end. If this is a version of the contemporary shoreline, a reduced one. This is a generic future projection of the bay in the absence of barriers, which of course we will slow this down and modify this expansion, but the bay is headed towards, in the long run, getting much bigger. And that's a future view compared to the historical. Kind of interesting, they're basically almost exactly the same, except for the future is actually going to be even wider than the historical a bit, because the sea has been rising and is rising faster and faster. So the bay is headed towards continuing its trend to getting bigger. And also we have subsided some areas around the edge of the bay, unfortunately. So it's actually lower as well as the sea going higher. So the bay is getting bigger. So the shoreline is going to change once again. It's going to sort of undermine our sense of permanence around the edge. Now, that's caused a really interesting, it's caused this shift in the way we look at the bay. When we made this map of the historical habitats of San Francisco Bay about a little over 20 years ago, we were looking at it particularly for wetland restoration and wildlife habitat and ecosystem, the ecosystem. And so we really were focusing on the brown tidal flats and the green tidal marshes and all the narrow strips of beaches, which you can't really see, and the natural salt ponds and marsh pans. But now it's interesting, I look at this map and I see that still, of course, which has become a major social priority, as Dave mentioned, to restore major elements of that, bring that back. But we also see them as these natural infrastructure that softens the sea level rise, or softens storm surges and waves coming towards the shoreline. And interestingly, if you look closely, you notice that there was nearly a perimeter of nice wetland, mudflat, shallow bay protection, if you will, of the lower lying areas around the bay. And interestingly, the steeper areas like Tiburon or parts of San Francisco, Marin, Point Richmond, they didn't necessarily have marshes in front of them because they were steep and deep. But they didn't really need it because they were higher and drier. And so the lower areas where you were potentially vulnerable, the low-lying areas were essentially naturally protected by this legacy of mudflats, beaches, and marshes. So now as we come more towards our last few decades, on the positive side, we have really learned how to restore these features. We've really gained a strong skill set and political infrastructure, as Dave showed, of how to do this. We really have gotten quite good at restoring tidal marshes, has this view of the marshes in Napa, Napa River, when it really was a tidal channel, or a tidal wetland channel. Napa River and the vast tidal mesh networks and the beaches along the shoreline. We've gotten good at how to restore beaches. So, and we've really demonstrated that with amazing projects, as this project, a photo of new restored marsh shows. So we've gotten quite good at how to restore these features, and we really have actually started moving back in effect as we have restored areas. We have given more space to the bay. So, and we have this remarkable legacy and opportunity created by previous decades of environmental activism and political, social decisions to protect much of the shallow waters around the bay, not so much in the central bay, but particularly in the South Bay and the North Bay and parts of the Central Bay. We still have that opportunity to use shallow water intertidal habitats as part of our toolkit to protect the edge of the bay. So that's a remarkable achievement and opportunity that we're talking about today. And so we have, I like to think of it looking, from this perspective, a second try, a second chance to reconceive of the shoreline, which we treated in a pretty industrial way, not really valuing the recreation, the public access, the kind of health and nature benefits of a more natural shoreline, as well as the flood protection benefits of nature. So the question is, what will we build this time? What will we do this time? And looking at this sort of retrospective, if you will, two major themes or principles come out to me. One is really the subject of this series, seminar, webinar, which is to design with nature and use the natural infrastructure, take advantage of the natural infrastructure that is available to help modulate the effects of sea level rise. And we've gotten quite good at that, but we need to do much more, and we are working towards that. And then the second principle or challenge or goal in my mind is something we've less figured out how to do, which is to start building more flexibility into the shoreline, start planning for flexibility in the coming decades. And that's probably harder to do, and we haven't really cracked the code on that one, but it could involve things like looking at infrastructure replacement cycles, with wastewater and highways and natural gas pipelines and all the things along the shoreline. Like when we build it next time, what can we do differently to build more flexibility or have less infrastructure in harm's way? It could involve financing mechanisms so that we have the resources, like Measure A, but even more probably, so that when we do have to adapt the shoreline more dramatically and do some big expensive things, we have resource and we haven't just kicked the can down the road, and sort of built that intergenerational equity into the second half of the century when these challenges would be greater. It could also involve building, as we do use these areas along the shoreline, which are probably still usable for several decades or more, building flexibility into those plans so that we sort of know what we're going to do next, the transition to a wetter shoreline, more flexible shoreline. So that's hard to do, and I don't know that we've really done that yet, but we need, hopefully communities around the edge of the bay will start coming up with models so we can start experimenting and building that sort of flexibility that the bay shoreline needs over time. So I like to close, inspire myself or remind myself we can do this with this photograph from the 1930s, which shows us another big infrastructure transition in the bay when we were shifting from railroads with all these terminuses to ferries to get across the bay, to the Bay Bridge. The first Bay Bridge, which of course then 75 years later was replaced by the second Bay Bridge. And so we have in the past had to do this, there is this cyclical transformation of the infrastructure around the edge of the bay, this multi-generational redoing it, and perhaps even better the second or third time, arguably. So I will close there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was incredible. And those photographs and maps were just extraordinary to see. Our next speaker is Letitia Grenier from the San Francisco Estuary Institute.
Hi, I'm Letitia Grenier from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and I'm so pleased to get to talk to you all today. Thank you so much for coming to listen to us. We're really excited to get to share the results of the work that folks in the community who've been working on the bay and its wetlands for decades. We are very committed to this, and we're really excited to share this with others. So I'm going to pick up the story where Robin left off and talk about what have we been thinking about in these past 20 years about where the wetlands are at, how can we achieve our goals of retaining them because they're so valuable, and what does it mean for climate change, which is a challenge for the wetlands themselves. But there's a lot of options that we have. So looking back at that same map that Robin showed you in a little different version, I'm going to take you through time to start to talk about the actions that folks have been taking around the bay to try to bring back some of these incredibly valuable tidal marshes that were here in 1800 before they really started to get modified and diked and filled. So there were the marshes in 1800. And I think there's been a really good coverage of the value of tidal marshes in this program in general, but I'll just, I guess I'll just add one thought because they do so many things with it. Maybe a couple of them haven't been covered as much. One is that tidal marshes actually help create clean water. Our wastewater treatment plants put out a lot of nutrients. So they clean a lot of things out of the water, but there's still a lot of nutrients in the water, and that could cause those kind of algal blooms and fish die-offs that have happened here in the past and in other places. But one of the factors that's keeping that from happening is all the tidal marshes, these thousands of acres that we have left, are doing the job every day of taking in those nutrients and turning them into other things, cool things like plants and animals that we can then recreate and enjoy. So they have this really powerful function in that way. They also sequester contaminants, which is really helpful. They're valuable for flood control, which I think you've heard about. They sort of dampen the waves and reduce the erosion at the shoreline. And that means you can have a much lower levee behind a tidal marsh than if there is no marsh there. We have our endangered species there I'm going to talk a little bit about. But the thing I wanted to pause on for a moment was this idea of access to nature. We all know, especially after the past year and however many months, that we all desperately need to get outside for our emotional and physical and mental well-being. And what's cool about this edge of the bay, these baylands or tidal marshes, is that they're right down there in some of these either very industrial or very heavily urbanized parts of the bay. So to be able to create what is essentially almost wilderness areas, but definitely parks where people can get out there and move their bodies and look at beautiful nature all around them. That's really valuable. And it's different than when we make another park in the hills. I love the parks in the hills, but it's not easy for everybody to get to them. But putting these open spaces right down in the urban areas and industrial areas of the bay is really valuable for equity, creating more equal access to nature for our residents around the Bay Area. Okay, so back to my story. 1800, we had 190,000 acres of tidal marsh. By 1998, a lot of it was gone, although we'd even by then started to restore things. So this is the time when Robin was talking about when he was first involved in actually making these maps that I'm showing you now. And you can see that just an enormous amount of the tidal marsh was lost during this time. So much that a lot of people came together who were involved in studying the marshes, restoring the marshes, being the stewards of the marshes as government agencies, one way or another. And they said, what are we going to do? This was over 100 people came together and said, what are we going to do? We have this huge problem. And the answer was, we're going to stop building in the baylands, which we define as the areas that are between high and low tide, whether or not there's a levee there. So, essentially, as Robin was saying before, these are the baylands. That's how we define it. That area that sort of wants to be between high and low tide without people changing things. And so that was one big conclusion: no more developing, diking, or filling of the baylands. And the second one was that we need to restore back to about 100,000 acres of marsh if we want to have a healthy estuary. So all those really powerful services and functions that marshes provide are critical to the health of our bay, to clean water, to thriving wildlife, to healthy people, all of those things, to less flooding, et cetera. And so that's why it was important to restore many tens of thousands of acres to get to that point. And you can see by 2009, there had been some progress from that 1998 agreement among many people and agencies, but the real difference was all this other land that has been acquired and slated for restoration. And that was kind of the story that Dave told. You know, we're making really good progress toward restoration. It hasn't all been restored yet because it takes quite a while to finance and permit these projects, but this is quite a difference from where we started in 1998, where we're headed into the future. And if you add in the other kinds of habitat around the bay shore, not everything can be tidal marsh that used to be tidal marsh. So we do have these other types in the blue and yellow, and these are really valuable for other species, especially water birds. So you can see we're getting toward a pretty, lovely functional mosaic of habitat types for people and wildlife around the bay. And if we track our progress on a graph instead of on a map, you can see there on the left, 1800, about 190,000 acres of tidal marsh. The low point happened actually somewhere between 1800 and 1998. Then it starts increasing. And that post-restoration on the right is more or less everything that's been acquired and slated for restoration. So that's pretty good. That's 3/4 of the way toward the goal of 100,000 acres. I think that's really incredible progress. And the reason why was this coming together, as I described before, of so many different groups interested in this issue, advocates, scientists, government officials, choosing to head in this direction because it was so important for the health of the Bay Area. But enter climate change, unfortunately causing problems for this plan. And this sea level rise graph is a little out of date, but what you can see is that the arc of sea level rise is going to accelerate. So we've experienced about a foot of sea level rise over the past 100 years, but we're looking at several feet before the end of the century. We don't know where it's going to end up, could be as high as 6 feet. There's actually new projections that go even higher. So we're looking at quite a lot. And I think the important thing to remember, and this is a little bit what Robin was saying, we're used to sort of a steady rate of sea level rise, sort of manageable. But in a few years, that rate is going to increase so much, we're not going to know what hit us. It's really going to be different when we're seeing these high rates near the end of the century. So at the same time as that, we've lost sediment. And by sediment, I mean dirt carried in the water. We get that coming down from our watersheds and creeks and rivers. We get it coming out from the Delta, from the big rivers of the Sierras. And we used to have this really high amount of sediment in the 1900s. A lot of this was due to the gold rush. It took a long time for all the sediment that the mining created in the Sierras. So they mined gold in the Sierras. They essentially like washed down the hillside with giant hoses. That sediment got into the rivers and creeks, and it just took a really long time for it to get all the way down to us. And then we kind of used that up. So all of a sudden, around the year 2000, we found ourselves in a totally different sediment regime. So if you imagine that a tidal marsh can actually build up sediment over time, every time the tide comes in, it brings a little bit of sediment. As the tide turns around, that sediment drops out, falls onto the marsh, and stays there. The plants trap it. So tidal marshes have this amazing ability, as I think John Bourgeois described to you, to rise in elevation over time, but they need material to do it. So they are now lacking the material. We now have less sediment to build themselves up with, and more high waters coming in from the bay. So that's a big challenge with sea level rise. And scientists, oh, there's a picture of that hydraulic mining. It is really incredible. You can see just a whole bunch of this hillside is gone. They're just washing it away, trying to find the dirt that's embedded in all of that fine sediment. You can look at, there are these scientific models that can be used to try to understand what will happen to our marshes over time as sediment supply, depending on how much sediment there is in the water. And if we look at 2010 as the starting point here on the x-axis and 2100 or 2110 as the ending point, you can see that these green bars, which are our marshes, they decrease, essentially saying that our marshes are not going to be able to keep up with sea level rise if we're in a low sediment supply scenario. And this is the scenario we appear to be in: high sea level rise and low sediment supply. So that's unfortunate. we've sort of created that situation ourselves as humans. And what it means is that we're going to lose our super valuable coastal wetlands, our tidal marshes, unless we do something about it. However, if we were in a high sediment supply scenario, that's the difference between these two slides. Whoa, those green bars suddenly are much bigger and we pretty much don't lose that much marsh. So if we could do something to really change our sediment supply, that would make a very big difference. And so what happened because of this graph that I showed you before, that we see that these marshes that we've been working on collectively to restore, that have been coming back, that have been performing amazingly well as they have been restored, since there is this danger of losing them over time with sea level rise, pretty much the same organizations that had come together in 1998 did that again around 2015 to try to decide what to do about this situation. How are we going to think about sea level rise related to the Baylands? So it was a very robust process. And what I want you to notice about this is there were more than 200 people involved. We had a steering committee of 21 organizations and independent science review from 6 experts. So it was a really great community effort that I think, again, pushed toward a common mandate, which is so helpful when everybody's rowing in the same direction to make progress on these really complicated, large-scale issues. Here's our steering committee. You may not know all of these acronyms, but these are basically all the agencies and nonprofits, many of the organizations that are involved at a regional level in managing the bay. So out of that process with hundreds of folks, we came up with a lot of strategies of what we can do to maintain these ecosystems as climate changes. And I'm going to go through the 10 regional recommendations rather quickly. And a lot of these have to do with fostering that natural resilience that marshes have. So what are the things we can do to work with nature so that marshes' ability to rise and to migrate inland, that they do by themselves to protect us against sea level rise? We just want to foster that instead of fighting against it. So one of the big things we can do is reconnect the watersheds to the marshes by giving those, and that will give the marshes the sediment and fresh water they need to build elevation. And so the historical situation was we would have a river or a creek come in through some wetlands to the back of a marsh. This stuff with the squiggly lines are the tidal marshes. The squiggly lines are the channels with which the tide goes in and out. And so these things that sort of look like propagating waves are how sediment and water would get deposited. So when your creek is connected to your marsh, you're taking advantage of all that sediment and fresh water to grow that marsh, and that actually helps increase the elevation. What the fresh water does is actually help make peat. So you can build up a marsh with mud essentially, or you can build it up with peat, which is just plant matter underground. So both of the resources of sediment and fresh water are critical for this process. What we've done is urbanize the area that was upland. We've put our creeks and rivers in between levees, and then we dump the sediment fresh water way out here in the bay where it doesn't do us nearly as much good. So there are restoration projects to rebuild better connections like this one, where you still have your urban area, you still have some diked off ponds, but you can recreate this resilient marsh, and that is going to help protect the shoreline here. And this is an example where we're talking about using treated wastewater to do that from East Bay Dischargers Authority. I won't go through all these examples, but there are many types of historical connections of creeks to the bay. They looked like this in different ways. We have ideas of how to recreate some of that functionality now to get the most out of our marshes, keep them around as long as we can, and have them, enjoy the services that they provide us. The next recommendation is to design complexity and connectivity into the landscape. And that's really about recreating that mosaic of different kinds of habitats that was so valuable for the wildlife. And I think it's also really valuable for people. There's some scientific research that shows that the more diverse nature is in which people are living, the more benefits they get from it. So if you just are going to a park that just has a lawn and trees over it, that's different than if you're walking in a wild land with shrubs and trees and different kinds of animals and wetlands. And you may have experienced that yourself when you're taking a walk, that there's sort of these restorative benefits of a diverse landscape. And so here's an example. I think this is Marilyn Lotta's work, and she's going to be speaking later today, where if you look at a historic marsh, you can see how beautiful it is. There's different kinds of plants growing in different places. It's hard to see, but there's this special thing called gum plant with the yellow flowers that's really important for wildlife. And in the restored marsh, it takes a long time for that kind of complexity to build up. So it doesn't have that gum plant. It doesn't have that really important structure for wildlife, especially birds, to build their nests and to hide from high tide. So what they plan to do is actually build these mounds. They put these high spots into the marsh, and then that special plant, that gum plant, could colonize that spot and create an important place for wildlife to have refuge. And so this is just incredible. People got out there with their shovels in the mud. Marshes are really hard to work in. They're so muddy. They're wonderful from afar. They're a little bit less wonderful when you're in them, unless you're ready with all your boots and everything. And they built these mounds. They put the topsoil carefully back on with the vegetation. And they had this amazing success where you can see that gum plant is colonizing here and creating that special place where wildlife can breed and successfully raise their young. So that added complexity to the landscape. We think a lot about connectivity in the landscape. You know, if you are a black rail living in Pond 2A, are you going to be able to find another black rail to mate with and have your young? And so we think a lot about how are wildlife going to move around this landscape and create new territories and keep populations going. So that's one of the key things we have to think about. This is a new idea, that our third recommendation, to restore and conserve complete tidal wetland systems. I think we had focused a lot on the marsh, and you can see I talked a lot about the marsh, but for the marsh to function, which is this flat part in the middle, you need everything lower than the marsh, and Marilyn is going to talk about this later. You need the eelgrass and the oysters. This area protects the marsh and adds that complexity that we need ecologically. And then we also need this upland transition zone, and this is what helps protect, you know, the shoreline you have up here, which is usually not a tree. It's usually things like a freeway or the footing to a bridge or Google or Facebook or a neighborhood. Things we really care about are often sitting here where this tree is. And so we need this complete system to be protecting that area and providing all the functions that we want to get out of these complete tidal wetland systems. If you want to have this full system and all of its benefits, you can't just build it and leave it alone. You have to actually give it the processes, the physical processes. And what I mean by that are the connection to the creeks and rivers that I talked about before, and the connection to the full tidal energy of the bay. Those physical processes that are basically of flooding and transporting sediment and living organisms and food around, that's what makes these wetland systems so dynamic and resilient and adaptive and powerful. If we do things like put up tidal barriers, which has often been suggested as a solution for sea level rise, we will actually, unfortunately, lose the wetlands. They need that tidal energy to keep building up and keep rising as sea level rises. So we actually need to return more natural sort of physics to these areas, and then they can do all the services that we want them to do for us. And for that, we need to think about how we're going to get sediment into the marshes, as I talked about before. And one of the things we started thinking about is using upland sediment. There's a lot of development happening around the Bay Area. There's a lot of foundations being dug. And that dirt is going to go, largely is going as pads under individual development projects in flood prone areas. So like under somebody's house or under somebody's new building for a corporate campus. But we may want to be thinking about how can we use that dirt for the public good as part of a horizontal levee that may be protecting a whole city. So we might need to start thinking about this, because nobody is regulating sediment or dirt, and we need to be thinking about, ooh, this is a zero-sum game. Where is all of this going to go? As actually, I think we're already seeing the prices of dirt rise to the point that's affecting some public protection and restoration projects. So we recently, one of the recommendations of this report that we worked on in 2015 was to try to get a better handle on the sediment situation. That was recently completed just a couple of weeks ago. And we said to ourselves, how much sediment do we need? It's this enormous amount. I call it the cheese wheel. We tried to visualize it here, but it's about as much dirt as 2 times what was excavated for the Panama Canal. We're going to get about 30% of that with our current approach to managing the landscape. So that means that, you know, if we want to keep all of our tidal marshes and mud flats up through 2100, we really don't have enough sediment coming into the system right now to do that. And so we've got to change some of our management practices. And we have a lot of clear ideas about how to change those management practices. They involve a lot of coordination and really thinking about how we manage our systems from the open waters, largely undeveloped sort of headwaters of our creeks and rivers, down through the agricultural and urban areas and out to the Baylands. So we have a sort of a new mandate for ourselves on how to do that. And this is complicated. That's how it works spatially across a watershed. But we can talk about the very specifics if you want to in the Q&A of what are the actual actions that we should take in each of these kinds of places. And I'll just point out to you that migration space, conserving all the open areas we have left so that marshes can kind of walk their way inland as sea level rises. They will do that on their own at no cost to us if we give them space. There's not very much of that space left that's not already developed. So really thinking hard about what we do with those remaining areas as a region is, I think, really important. And then how we design the watersheds, like I showed you in the previous figure. And then what are we doing with dredge sediment from the bay? And we can talk about that more. At the moment, we're reusing about 1/3 of it, but we're throwing about 2/3 of it away. And we might want to rethink that as much as we can. Then we want to restore our marshes really soon. I think that's been talked about, to give them a leg up on sea level rise. The sooner the marshes are restored, the longer they'll be able to be resilient to sea level rise. It just takes time for a marsh to go from, you know, a barren kind of wasteland that was diked to a thriving ecosystem. This one actually has endangered species in it. So you got to give that marsh a little time to make that happen. We're going to plan for the Baylands to migrate, as I talked about. So here's the marshes on the right. And here's sort of the current edge of the tidal influence, but we know that edge of tidal influence is heading way inland. So all that space between the dotted lines, we could be conserving now and keeping that as open space rather than choosing to develop it or build a giant levee through the middle of it, or doing something that forecloses on the ability to have those marshes in the future. They're going to want to march inland. So you can acquire that migration space. You can make your own migration space with a horizontal levee. And I think you may have heard about that. And you can actually just plan to move out of it. You know, maybe there are some parking lots that we don't need near the edge of the bay, or a box store that could be somewhere else just as easily. We also need to pay more attention to our wildlife and actively conserve and monitor their populations. You might be surprised to know we spend very little money on wildlife monitoring. And what's going to happen is, with the bigger storms that are coming, we're going to see sort of larger, rapid declines in wildlife with some of the changes from climate change from the storms. And here's two of our favorite creatures, the salt marsh harvest mouse and the ridge-raised whale. Both of them are federally endangered and have been for about 50 years almost now. But there's lots of other amazing creatures in the marshes. They are so cute, but it's hard living in the marsh. And that hard living is what has made them actually have these really special adaptations through evolution. And that means that a lot of these are found nowhere else in the world. They're really special creatures that we have in San Francisco Bay. I won't go in detail to the other recommendations that are really about better organizing ourselves to track and monitor, but I will say that there's been a lot of progress on moving toward these. So we've created the Adaptation Atlas, which is a resource for cities and counties around the edge of the bay that actually maps where you can use nature-based solutions on every bit of the shoreline. And so maintaining that and keeping it updated so it's easy for somebody who wants to do a nature-based solution around the shoreline to access that and think about what the options are. We've also got the Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program up and running. And so this is taking our knowledge about wetlands and regionalizing them. It's much more efficient, and it should help us track climate change. And so I'll conclude by saying, you know, we find ourselves in this moment of choice. I think Robin talked really well about how we've altered the natural progress of the bay, and the ultimate endpoint of sort of creating a hard line, like this is not in the Bay Area, creating a hard line of defense like this levee means that the bay is on one side, it looks like that, it's got riprap and concrete and then water. You know, we've lost our wetlands if we don't choose to really focus on keeping them. And then we're all, you know, the downside of this, besides that this side does not look lovely, is that we're all living behind this levee. You can't even see the bay when you're living behind a giant levee. So this would be, I think, an unfortunate outcome that is probably not what people want. And what we'd rather see is coming up on my next slide. I want to thank my funders first. These are the funders who really made possible that series of analysis that we call the Baylands Ecosystem Habitat Goals Science Update. So thank you very much to them. What we really want to see on the shoreline is something like this, where we've invested in our wetlands. They're protecting our shoreline. We're taking all kinds of actions to produce and maintain these areas that are great for people and great for wildlife. We've got equitable access to the shoreline so that we can all stay healthy and keep our wildlife with us while we do so. Here's the URL to learn more about this report. And that's my email address if you'd like to ask any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Letitia. That was incredible, as were all three of our speakers. Now we are going to go into about a half-an-hour Q&A, followed by a short 5-minute break. And then after that, we will have our next three speakers. So for those of you in the audience, now's the time to get your questions into that Q&A box if you have questions for our first three speakers. Let's see. A first question we have, how does each city figure out which nature-based solutions will work best for their own shoreline and be cost effective? And maybe Letitia, you could start with that one. You mentioned the Adaptation Atlas. And I'm wondering what other resources or support there is for city officials to connect them with those and walk them through those resources.
That's a great question. I think it's really important because we have to realize that not every jurisdiction is going to have that expertise in-house. So at the moment, we do have the Adaptation Atlas. If you Google it, Adaptation Atlas San Francisco Bay, you'll find it. It's a first cut at helping people think of options. The BCDC, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, has been working on a process called BayAdapt to think about how these adaptation pathways can work in each stretch of the shoreline. And as part of that, they want to fund kind of a help desk where SFEI and other entities like us could provide technical services so that those who are interested in nature-based adaptation solutions can come and we could work with you one-on-one. The truth is that every bit of the shoreline is its own thing. And so that you really have to have a customized design in each part. So I would say talk to your local officials like Dave Pine and see if there's a way to support that help desk function.
Vicky asks, what authority do the various Bay agencies and authorities have to convince, coax, or require cities not to cut off wetlands via walls or other non-ecological responses to sea level rise and not allow new construction in the sea level rise zone? Who wants to take that one?
There are pretty strong protections for wetlands under the Clean Water Act. Any wetlands that are functioning around our Bay Area often have endangered species, so then they often have strong protections under the Endangered Species Act. So basically, federal and state regulations are pretty strong. It gets tricky when there's an area that would be between high and low tide, except that somebody is actively pumping the water out, essentially, and trying to maintain it dry so that it can be used for development. I think it's a gray area when it gets to that place. And that's where we often see litigation start to happen and a difference of opinion on what the best use of that shoreline is right there.
And then I would add that, of course, local, land use decisions along the bayfront, those are made by local jurisdictions. So they are, of course, subject to the federal and state regulatory overlays, but ultimately it's the local city council is going to make these decisions. So, advocacy at the local level is really important.
We love to hear that at the Sierra Club.
I would just say, a good example of that is here in Burlingame, where I live, there was a parcel of land owned by the state. There was a big debate about what to do with it, whether to use it for additional hotels or there was a proposal to actually convert this parcel into a restored wetland, and that carried the day in large part due to local advocacy.
Dave, we have a question from Shin Ray, which I think is for you. It says, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority solicits restoration, design, and construction proposals for grant funds, considering certain types of habitats might be more feasible at certain locations in the region. How can SFBRA direct what types of proposals from where it might prioritize?
Well, to date, we've conducted 4 solicitations for grants, and we really haven't attempted to kind of narrow the criteria for those applications. That's something we might do in the future. For example, one of our goals is to do more subtidal restoration. So, potentially we could do a grant round focused on that. But right now our grants are really open to any type of restoration project.
Jeffrey says, it seems we have a considerable challenge replacing naturally deposited sediments due to how we have occupied the landscape and altered the watersheds. Has consideration been given to studying the impact of mining sediments from deeper parts of the bay to restore and ultimately maintain wetlands?
There's been a lot of consideration for that. Dredging or mining sediment from the bay has its own impacts and a lot of regulatory requirements. So that pretty much only happens for navigation at this point. It happens in some flood control channels where it's important to get the sediment out from there so that the flood control channel can actually provide flood risk management. The other issue with it, besides that regulatory issue, is that if we mine sediment from the deeper parts of the bay, it just fills right back in. So it's a little bit of a zero-sum game. A better approach, we think, is to work on that, I think you put it really well, work on the landscape management and the way that we design and manage our watersheds so that we can, rather than having to, use a bunch of machinery to mine sediment and then, burning more carbon and creating more pollution as we move it around, the ideal thing is to use the natural physics of the landscape, such as rivers and marshes, flooding in the right places, to move it where we want it. And I think engineering is moving that way. So the field of engineering is actually changing over these decades to start to think about using nature as an engineer in a way that's helpful to people rather than harmful. But that takes decades of, changing the way engineering is taught in schools. But the National Academies of Sciences has actually been working on that question of how do we create the engineers of the future who are going to be able to use landscapes in a positive way to help us all deal with climate change.
Gail says, these are great strategies, yet engineers are inclined to build seawalls. So are there case studies that show nature-based solutions work?
There are some really cool case studies. So I'm going to start with some recent research out of the Gulf and Atlantic coast where they've had hurricanes and they've looked at, of course, they've had way more hurricanes lately, and they've looked at the performance of nature-based shorelines and sort of hybrid shorelines, maybe like the horizontal levee, where you've still got something in the background that's constructed, but then in the front, you've got a nature-based solution like a marsh. And they've compared those to things like seawalls and bulkheads, and there's some really interesting results. One is that after the hurricane, you had to put a bunch of money into fixing broken seawalls and bulkheads. So they were expensive to repair afterward. And that's maybe to be expected. But what I thought was more amazing than that is that whatever the property was that was being protected behind that nature-based solution or bulkhead or seawall, it actually had much less damage if it was protected by a natural feature. So if that was your house was in much better shape if you were protected by a marsh or a beach than if you were protected by a bulkhead or a seawall, which is to me pretty amazing that the nature-based solutions function better and were cheaper. And so I think, this is really new research. Unfortunately, we don't have decades and decades of sort of weight of evidence with the economics attached, but that is we do have some proof of concept happening in the academic literature. In addition, in the real world here in the Bay Area, a horizontal levee has been built and it's doing the things that people wanted it to do. So it's has this come up in your seminar already? I thought it had. There are these levees that are sort of a federal levee in the back that really is very protective for flooding of people. But then in the front, it's got this really gentle slope, and that's essentially you build a marsh on it by watering that marsh with treated wastewater. And those are performing really well in terms of creating wildlife habitat, protecting what's behind them, and also treating the wastewater. So it's kind of a triple win. So we do have some examples in the real world of these functioning quite well.
We have a question from John. In the Petaluma Marsh, we have several agencies and government bodies involved. How do we get together on setting priorities? Petaluma City is included due to flooding and sediment dredging, to state and federal lands, to redwood landfill, to farmers owning the edges. Sounds like there's a lot of stakeholders involved.
It's always a complex situation to have, so many agencies involved in a project. You want to have a lead agency that's going to, help shepherds everyone's energy in the same direction. I'm not familiar with the situation in Petaluma, unfortunately.
A question for Robin. How do we know if 100,000 acres will be enough to keep a sustainably healthy bay?
Well, the great thing is there was a lot of work that went into that goal of 100,000 acres, and that was the work of the first Bayland Goals project. And so there's a several hundred-page report that was produced out of a 5-year process with, I think, over 100 scientists. We had wetland scientists, obviously, but we had fish experts and waterfowl experts and shorebird experts and mammals and amphibians. So a lot of thought went into that, into analyzing what the different species need and what they had before, what made sense to try to aim for. So I know it's a round number, but it came from a lot of thought by a lot of people. So in that report, we could perhaps put the link in there if people are curious. It's the San Francisco Bayland Habitat Goals Project. So I think that's something we can still rely on for that big picture perspective. And then there's the next version of the report, which Letitia led, which then updates that looking towards sea level rise. So those are the two foundational documents for kind of all the things we're talking about here.
There was a part 2 for that. We are halfway to that 100,000 acres, I believe is what you said. Presumably that's the low hanging fruit. What do you see as the most important tools to get us to the next half?
Now, part of the challenge will be where we find there's about, we're 22,000 acres shy of land that is now in private ownership, that's not set aside for restoration. So to make it all the way to 100,000, we're going to have to find those acres somewhere. A lot of the acreage that is now being restored was transferred from the Cargill salt in the early part of the early 2000s. So hopefully we'll be able to see future acquisitions along those lines, or even donations of property. One of the biggest undeveloped parcels that's still in private ownership is the Cargill lands, and there's a great advocacy to have that property moved into the National Wildlife Park Refuge System and hopefully restored, but it is in private ownership today.
Thank you. William asks, many of the priority development areas for housing in the East Bay, such as in the city of Alameda, are on shorelines. Do we need to shift affordable housing development inland to protect marshes?
I guess my main reaction to that idea is we may want to, if we're actually talking about affordable housing right on the shoreline, we might want to shift it inland to protect people. There's this historical, unfortunate situation in the Bay Area with redlining where a lot of disadvantaged communities were placed in flood-prone areas, and we need to be careful not to be repeating that issue. I think assuming it's in not a flood-prone area of the shoreline, there are a few of those. What I would say is we did a recent analysis looking at, rather than building up the shoreline where we're going to need to be getting all of these other services that we talked about from our wetlands and beaches, et cetera, what about densifying in urban areas? And we did an analysis that looked at, could you actually densify San Jose and make it greener and more livable for people while sparing outlying areas? That could be the shoreline, or that could be rural areas, and getting the ecosystem services of retaining those as open space. And what we found was it's very doable. It's a political change, but it's the kind of thing that we have to start focusing on. Rather than developing open space, we kind of need to redevelop our already developed areas so that we can all benefit from those open spaces, the services they provide, the recreational areas they provide. If anyone's interested in that analysis, it's called Integrated Planning with Nature. If you Google Integrated Planning with Nature, you'll find that.
Thank you. We have a question possibly for Dave. Parts of San Mateo's Bay Shore are dependent on pumping. Has there been discussion of purchasing more properties along the Bay Shore?
Well, that's an important point that people often forget, is that the San Mateo County Bay Shore, and I assume other portions of the Bay Shore throughout the Bay, are very vulnerable flooding in the event of a large storm, when the creeks rise and the amount of water flowing to the bay really substantially increases. And then if you have a high tide, that water can be blocked from entering the bay, causing substantial flooding. So for that reason, there are numerous pumps, installed along the San Mateo County shoreline to move that water into the bay in the event of those conditions. So, one thing that I think jurisdictions need to be aware of is to make sure that those pumps are able to withstand a storm event, that they have their own source of electricity. If we had a major storm event and lost power, those pumps still need to continue to work. So I think they're really kind of out of sight, out of mind, but they're something that I think deserve more focus.
Thank you. Tom asks, if we were to use natural flows of sediment to create marshes, wouldn't we need to embark on large-scale bay-wide creek restoration projects?
Essentially, yes. I'm advocating for that. But there's ways of getting the sediment out to the bay without fully restoring the creek. A lot of it can be about how reservoirs are managed. This is not easy to change how reservoirs are managed. But if we can pulse the flows out of the reservoirs and push a lot of sediment with essentially high flows, that can get the sediment all the way to the bay. It gives that enough energy to push the sediment to the bay. It's also really good for salmon habitat. It kind of scours their spawning gravels, so they have places to put their eggs. At the same time, you do have to do some floodplain restoration, so you're not flooding the wrong thing with those pulsed flows. There's these new ideas of spilling sediment from the bottom of dams. If you take the water from the top, you're kind of decanting the clean water. If you take the water from the bottom, you're getting all that nice dirty sediment-laden water. There's ideas about slurrying sediment. There's ideas about dredging reservoirs. So there are different ways that we might be able to access some of those materials.
Great. Well, this was just an incredible first set of speakers. I really want to thank you all so much for joining and spending your morning with us. We are all now going to go take a 5-minute break. And at 10:26, we'll be back here with our next panelists.